Chapter 7. The Realm of Dissonance. Alice closed her eyes as she plunged off the towering mahogany bookshelf. She braced herself for the stomach-dropping terror of a 20-foot fall, but the sensation never came. Instead, the instant she broke through the rippling blue light of the portal, the world tilted sideways. The rushing sensation of the veil washed over her, thick, cold, and incredibly heavy, before her boots slammed into solid ground barely a few feet below where she had jumped. The transition was violent. The absolute heavy silence and the dry scent of ancient parchment were instantly ripped away, replaced by the deafening roar of crashing waves and a blast of freezing, salty wind. Alice stumbled forward onto slick, wet stone, falling to her knees. Mango, who was still clinging tightly to her shoulder, let out a sharp, unhappy yowl as the wind caught his fur. A second later, Mal landed heavily beside her, Poppet dropping gracefully from his back to land perfectly on all four paws in the dark. "Everyone all right?" Mal shouted, barely audible over the roar of the gale. "I think so," Alice yelled back, pushing her damp hair out of her eyes. She scrambled to her feet, shivering uncontrollably as the freezing wind bit right through the thin, pleated white linen of her basque dress. She squinted into the gloom, trying to get her bearings. They had landed on the very edge of a towering, jagged cliff. Directly below them, a black, furious ocean was slamming against the sharp rocks, and the remains of what looked like a great fleet of ships were wrecked below them, their shattered wooden hulls moving back and forth in the rough sea, sending massive plumes of freezing white spray high into the air. The sky above was a chaotic, churning mass of dark purple and bruised black clouds. Suddenly, a massive fork of jagged violet lightning split the sky, illuminating the horrific landscape of Severin's realm. It was a world entirely devoid of warmth. There was no soft moss like the briarwood, and no golden sun like bast. It was wild, rugged, and brutal. The ground was composed of jagged slate-grey rock. Only a few twisted skeletal trees clung desperately to the cliffside, their bare branches whipping violently in the storm. Miles in the distance, illuminated only by the frantic flashes of lightning, loomed a massive, jagged mountain range that looked like a row of broken teeth against the stormy horizon. "This frequency is agonizing," Poppet projected into Alice's mind, his mental voice tight with discomfort. He was standing perfectly still, his yellow eyes wide and his dark coat entirely puffed up against the cold. "The earth here is screaming. It is raw, chaotic dissonance." "And it is incredibly wet," Mango added miserably, lifting one paw from the slick stone and shaking it vigorously. "I demand we find somewhere dry immediately. My coat is being entirely ruined by this atmospheric catastrophe." Alice couldn't argue with him. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the heavy bruised clouds above looked ready to unleash a torrential downpour at any second. If they stayed out on the exposed cliff face, the dark magician wouldn't even need to hunt them down. The exposure would finish them off. "We need shelter!" Alice shouted to Mal, pointing away from the furious ocean and toward a cluster of large, jagged boulders slightly inland. "Before the rain starts!" Mal nodded grimly, hastily shoving the silver and gold disc back into his leather pouch to protect it from the elements. "Stay close! Watch your footing! The rock is like ice!" With the two black cats darting ahead as dark, sleek shadows, Alice and Mal began to pick their way carefully across the treacherous cliff top. The wind howled around them, tearing at their clothes and threatening to push them right off the edge with every violent gust. Another massive crack of violet lightning illuminated the sky, followed almost instantly by a boom of thunder so loud it vibrated deep in Alice's chest. "There!" Mal yelled, pointing ahead. Just beyond the skeletal trees, the jagged rock formation curved inward, creating a deep, shallow overhang that looked just wide enough to block the wind and rain. They scrambled toward it, slipping and sliding on the wet slate. Mango and Poppet ducked under the overhang first, shaking the freezing spray from their coats with violent full-body shivers. Alice practically threw herself into the small cave a moment later, collapsing against the dry, rough stone wall at the back of the hollow. Mal ducked in right behind her, his chest heaving as he wiped the salt spray from his beard. Outside their small sanctuary, the heavens finally opened up. The rain didn't fall. It slammed into the earth in heavy, freezing sheets, instantly turning the cliff top into a treacherous river of black water. Alice pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around herself as she shivered in the freezing dark. She was a long, long way from her cosy English cottage. "Well," Mal rasped, leaning his head back against the stone wall and looking out into the violent storm, "welcome to the realm of the dark magician." For the next few hours, the small, jagged cave was a miserable sanctuary. The freezing rain battered the rocky overhang relentlessly, accompanied by the deafening crack of violet lightning and the furious roar of the black ocean below. Alice sat huddled with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, shivering violently in her thin linen dress. On one side of her, Mal sat in stoic silence, his jaw clenched against the biting cold, while Mango and Poppet had curled themselves tightly against Alice's sides, sharing their warmth. The heavy, chaotic static of Severin's magic hummed unpleasantly in Alice's skull, a stark, painful contrast to the peaceful resonance of the briarwood. When morning finally arrived, it offered little comfort. A pale, sickly grey sun dragged itself above the churning horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the wet slate of the cliff top. But it didn't stay long. Within minutes, the bruised purple clouds rolled back over the sky, swallowing the sun entirely and plunging the world back into a gloomy twilight. But at the very least, the freezing rain finally stopped. "Well," Mal rasped, his voice rough and thick with exhaustion as he slowly pushed himself to his feet. His knees popped loudly in the quiet cave. "We can't stay here." Alice uncurled herself stiffly, her teeth chattering as she stood. She looked out at the desolate slate-grey landscape leading toward the distant jagged mountains. The wind was still howling, carrying a bitter chill that sliced right through her damp clothes. "We need to find somewhere warmer," Alice agreed, wrapping her arms around herself, "and somewhere to rest properly. I don't think I can walk much further if we don't." "The thought occurs to me," Mango projected, standing up and executing a long, luxurious stretch that ended in a massive yawn, "that we perhaps could have spent a bit more time planning for this specific journey. A warm blanket would have been an excellent addition to our supplies." He paused, his golden eyes narrowing slightly at Alice's makeshift linen backpack, perhaps bringing some substantial food as well. Half a flatbread and a piece of cold barsed quail is hardly a feast fit for a rescue mission of this magnitude. Poppet shook his head slowly, his sleek black coat ruffled by the cold wind. "We do not have the luxury of time, brother, and we are here now anyway, so let's make the best of a wet and cold situation." Mal managed a weak, exhausted chuckle, adjusting his leather pouch. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mango, but staying here won't help matters. We need to move. If Severin is siphoning the magic of an entire realm, he won't be hiding in a cave. He'll have a stronghold." He pointed toward the jagged teeth of the distant mountains. "My guess is we head that way." With no better option, the four of them stepped out of the shallow cave and began the long, treacherous trek across the slick slate. The landscape of Severin's realm was utterly desolate. There was no grass, no glowing moss, no life of any kind, just endless stretches of sharp, broken rock and the occasional skeletal tree twisted by the relentless wind. They walked for a couple of hours in near silence, heads bowed against the biting wind, their boots crunching heavily on the loose stone. The sounds of the distant crash of the ocean had now faded, leaving only the occasional crack of violet lightning illuminating the heavy clouds. Finally, they crested a small rocky hill. Alice stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Mal stumbled to a halt beside her, his weathered face draining of all colour. Spread out in the wide, shallow valley below them was the aftermath of an absolute massacre. It looked like the remains of a massive recent battle. The rocky ground was scorched black in large circular craters, the stone melted into glass by an unimaginably hot fire. Shattered wooden carts, splintered siege engines, and the twisted remains of rusted armour lay scattered for miles across the desolate plain. The smell of ash hung heavily in the freezing air. "What happened here?" Poppet projected, his mental voice uncharacteristically quiet, his yellow eyes wide as he stared down at the devastation. "The dissonance in the earth here is agonizing. The veil has been torn to shreds." "Severin," Mal whispered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This wasn't a battle between armies. This was a slaughter. He destroyed whatever came here before they claimed his realm. They probably used the wrecked ships we saw at the cliff to reach here, perhaps to take on the wizard." Mango sat down heavily on the cold stone, wrapping his tail around his paws as he looked out over the ruined army. "Has it escaped anyone's notice that we are but 2 humans and 2 cats? If an entire fleet of warriors could not defeat this dark magician, what exactly is our plan? We do not even have a sword." Poppet stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the distant, jagged mountains. "That might be our greatest advantage, Mango. A massive army announces its arrival. They are a target. A small group, however, might use stealth to get where an army could not." Alice swallowed hard, forcing herself to look past the scorched craters. Closer to the base of the hill, partially sheltered by a cluster of massive charred boulders, she spotted the remains of an encampment. A dozen heavy canvas tents were still standing, though several were burned or torn apart. The heavy grey fabric flapped wildly in the wind. "Look!" Alice pointed, her hand trembling slightly in the cold. "Down there! Tents! They might still have supplies inside, or, at least, some dry clothes." "It's a risk," Mal noted grimly, "but we're going to freeze to death out here if we don't find shelter." "And perhaps some food," Mango chimed in, perking up slightly at the prospect. With heavy hearts and exhausted limbs, they began the slow, careful descent down the hill and into the graveyard of the shattered valley. They picked their way through the debris, giving the blasted craters and the fallen men a wide berth, until they reached the cluster of standing tents. Mal cautiously pushed aside the heavy canvas flap of the largest one, peering into the gloom before gesturing for Alice and the cats to follow. Inside, it was dry and blissfully sheltered from the howling wind. The tent had clearly belonged to a commander. A large wooden table was overturned in the centre, but resting in the corner was an intact iron brazier filled with half-burned coals. Better yet, draped over a heavy wooden chest were several thick wool-lined cloaks. "Thank heavens," Alice breathed. She immediately grabbed one of the heavy dark green cloaks, wrapping it tightly over her freezing white linen dress. The warmth of the thick wool was instant and glorious. Mal tossed a second cloak over his own shoulders, then knelt by the iron brazier. Finding a piece of flint resting on the lip of the bowl, he struck it quickly against a discarded dagger. A spark caught the dry tinder, and within moments a warm, crackling fire was casting a welcoming orange glow around the tent. Mango didn't care about the cloaks or the fire. His nose was already twitching as he trotted toward an overturned supply crate. "I knew it!" Mango projected triumphantly, using his paw to pry open a small leather satchel that had spilled onto the floor. "Preserved meats and hard cheese. It is not exactly a royal banquet. but it will certainly do. Alice slumped onto the floor by the fire, letting out a long sigh of relief as the heat finally began to seep back into her bones. She was finally warm. She fell asleep instantly. Mal watched her chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm, then turned his attention to the rest of the commander's tent. He looked around for any useful supplies, but the interior was largely bare, save for the overturned table and the few pieces of preserved meat Mango and Poppet were currently nibbling on. He decided to go out searching the rest of the tents and the surrounding area for anything they could use, leaving Alice to doze peacefully by the warm fire with the cat standing guard. When he returned half an hour later, he was carrying a massive, heavy bundle wrapped in canvas. Alice stirred at the sound of his heavy boots crunching against the dirt floor. She blinked, looking up groggily as Mal dropped the bundle with a loud metallic clank next to the iron brazier. He unfolded the canvas, revealing a small armoury. There was a large, heavy broadsword with a plain leather hilt for himself, and a smaller, more slender blade that looked incredibly sharp, clearly meant for Alice. Beside the swords lay thick leather sheaths, 2 sturdy belts, and a couple of small, wicked-looking daggers. But it wasn't just weapons. Mal pulled out a pile of practical clothing salvaged from the abandoned packs outside: thick wool-lined trousers, sturdy linen shirts, and heavy padded tunics. Beneath the pile were 2 pairs of long reinforced leather boots and dry woolen socks. Alice sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she stared at the impressive haul. "While you get changed," Mal said, his voice low and serious as he began to unbuckle his own damp tunic, "I am going to get some wine and food I saw not far away in the quartermaster's tent." Mango paused mid-bite of his hard cheese, his golden eyes narrowing suspiciously at the pile of swords and trousers. "You left the wine and the food behind?" Mango projected, his mental tone laced with profound disbelief. "To bring us heavy trousers and sharp sticks." "Why?" Mal sighed, offering the black cat a tired, wry smile. "I cannot carry everything at once, Mango. I won't be long." He pulled the heavy green cloak tight around his shoulders and slipped back out through the canvas flap, instantly swallowed by the howling wind of the desolate valley. With Mal gone, the tent was quiet save for the crackle of the iron brazier and the howling wind outside. Alice stood up stiffly, her muscles aching in protest after the short, exhausted nap. She quickly shed the ruined, freezing white linen dress of bast, letting it fall to the dirt floor. The heavy wool-lined trousers Mal had found were a little loose around her waist, but the thick leather belt solved the problem perfectly. She pulled the dry linen shirt over her head, followed by the padded tunic. Finally, she slid her freezing feet into the thick woolen socks and the sturdy leather boots. For the first time since stepping through the portal in her own garden, Alice felt protected. She wasn't wearing magical gold or a fluffy pink fleece dressing gown. She was dressed for a fight. She walked over to the pile of weapons by the fire. She picked up the slender sword Mal had brought for her. It was surprisingly heavy, the cold steel gleaming orange in the firelight. She gave it a tentative swing, the blade hissing softly through the warm air. It felt awkward in her hand, unbalanced and dangerous, but the weight of it was strangely comforting. "Your stance is terrible," Poppet observed telepathically from his spot near the overturned crate. He was sitting perfectly upright, his yellow eyes tracking the tip of the sword. "If you swing like that against an armoured opponent, you will break your own wrist." Alice stopped mid-swing, lowering the blade with a huff. "I'm a writer, Poppet, not a gladiator. I've never held a sword in my life." "Then keep the pointy end facing the dark magician," Poppet projected dryly, curling his dark tail neatly around his paws. "And perhaps try not to look so surprised when you swing it." Alice rolled her eyes, but she adjusted her grip, trying to hold the hilt a little firmer. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, swinging the sword in a wide horizontal arc. It still felt clumsy, but slightly more controlled. She imagined Severin, a faceless, terrifying sorcerer, standing in front of her and gave the air a sharp thrust. "I wonder if the quartermaster had any salmon," Mango projected suddenly, completely ignoring Alice's impromptu sword practice. He was lying on his back near the fire, his paws batting lazily at a stray spark that popped from the brazier. "We are miles inland, on a battlefield of glass and ash," Poppet pointed out, his tone dripping with long-suffering patience. "There will be no salmon, brother." "Perhaps they brought salted fish," Mango countered, rolling onto his side to look at the tent flap. "Armies eat salted fish, do they not? Or perhaps a nice thick stew. I would not object to a stew, provided it is heavy on the meat and light on the root vegetables." Alice slid the slender sword into its leather sheath, buckling the heavy belt around her padded tunic. "I think we should just be grateful if Mal comes back with anything edible, Mango. That cheese you're eating looks like it could double as a rock." "It is incredibly tough," Mango agreed, chewing thoughtfully on a small piece he had saved. "But the flavour profile is robust. Still, I expect better from the Scotsman. He promised wine. I intend to hold him to it." Poppet let out a long, rumbling mental sigh. "You are impossible." Before Mango could defend his culinary priorities, the heavy canvas flap of the tent was pushed aside. Mal ducked back inside, bringing a blast of freezing, ash-scented wind with him. He quickly tied the flap shut and turned to face them, looking utterly exhausted but victorious. Slung over his shoulder was a heavy burlap sack, and clutched in his hand were 2 dark glass bottles. "Success," Mal breathed, dropping the heavy sack onto the dirt floor next to the brazier with a heavy thud. Mango was on his feet instantly, trotting over to inspect the burlap sack. "What did you bring? Is it stew? Please tell me it is not more hard cheese." "No cheese," Mal smiled weakly, unstopping one of the dark bottles and taking a long, deep pull. He handed the second bottle to Alice. "Heavy, spiced wine, and—" He reached into the sack and pulled out a large waxed paper bundle. "Dried venison, heavily salted pork, and a few slightly stale loaves of bread. It's not a banquet, but it will keep us moving for a few days." Alice took a sip of the wine. It was strong and tasted heavily of cloves and dark berries, instantly sending a new rush of warmth down into her stomach. "It's perfect, Mal. Thank you." "Acceptable," Mango projected, already using his paw to tear at the waxed paper wrapping the pork, "though I still say a nice salmon would have tied the meal together." Mal chuckled, walking over to the pile of weapons. He picked up the heavy broadsword, inspecting the edge before sliding it smoothly into the large leather sheath. He strapped the weapon across his back, then picked up one of the small daggers, sliding it into his boot. He looked at Alice, taking in her new practical attire and the slender sword resting on her hip. The soft, terrified woman in the white linen dress was gone, replaced by a determined survivor. "You look ready," Mal said quietly, his blue eyes meeting hers in the firelight. Alice rested her hand on the hilt of her sword, taking a deep breath. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be. We have food, we have warm clothes, and we have weapons." She looked down at the 2 black cats, who were currently ripping enthusiastically into the salted pork. "Now, how do we find Severin?" Mal unscrewed the dark bottle of spiced wine, taking a long, slow drink before wiping his bearded mouth with the back of his hand. He looked past the dancing orange flames of the brazier, out toward the canvas flap that separated them from the freezing, howling wasteland. "I don't know," Mal admitted, his voice low and heavy with exhaustion. He walked over to the thick woolen cloaks he had laid out near the fire, lowering himself heavily onto the dirt floor. "I think we should keep heading inland to the mountain. That kind of jagged peak is a natural fortress, and the chaotic dissonance of the air seems to be pulling us in that direction." He looked back at Alice, his blue eyes softening in the firelight. But before anything else, we should eat and sleep. We all need rest. We've been running on pure adrenaline since bath." "He is entirely correct," Poppet projected, having already finished his portion of the pork. He gracefully leapt onto one of the thick green cloaks, curling his sleek black body into a tight, warm ball. A weary mind is a careless mind, and we cannot afford to be careless in this realm. Mango, his face still happily buried in the waxed paper, paused just long enough to send a mental nod of agreement before returning to his meal. Alice walked over to the fire, sitting cross-legged on the thick wool beside Mal. She tore off a piece of the stale bread and chased it with another warming swallow of the spiced wine. For the first time since the librarian had blasted the nightmares back into the dark, her heartbeat finally slowed to a normal rhythm. The wind raged outside, tearing at the heavy canvas of the tent, but inside they were warm, armed, and together. Mal pulled his cloak tightly around his shoulders, resting his hand casually on the hilt of his broadsword. "Eat up, Alice," Mal murmured, his eyes already drifting shut in the warmth of the brazier. "Severin can wait until tomorrow."